Hello and welcome to another episode of Galbraith Does Psych. Today I'm here to present another one of these review format videos where we take some studies from psychology, particularly the AQA A-level, and I discuss them, offer my thoughts on certain key criteria as a way of helping you to go over the study and also give you some evaluation material. So today we're going to look at the Bahrick et al. Study of duration of LTM. There he is. What a legend Harry Bahrick is. Only in 2019 he was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Psychological Association. He is considered an absolute legend. He's been in the field for decades. Grew up in kind of the 30s and 40s. Was attached to the US military for a little while, but so the story goes, he kind of did an aptitude test, and just before a huge battle was kind of drafted back out of the military to go and study engineering, I think it was, to start with. And yeah, the rest is history. He's an absolute legend in psychology. So Harry Bahrick and colleagues, they were interested in looking at the duration of LTM. So what they did was they recruited 392 people who had, some of them had only just graduated a couple of weeks ago from college. Some of them had graduated around 50 years ago. So there's a huge range of people and experience in terms of age and how long ago they'd been to college. And what they did was they took photos and names from people's yearbooks and basically tested them in a variety of ways, looking at, can people recognise photos of people they went to school with? Can people recognise the names? Can people match the names to the faces and all that kind of thing? As you can see from my graphical representation, I haven't got figures on there, I know, but basically the findings are that over time, as you'd expect, people's memories did start to deteriorate and recall accuracy did decrease the longer it had been since they graduated from college. But an interesting finding was that there was quite a difference between recognition and free recall. So if they were just told, tell me the names of the people that you went to school with, that was worse than, here's a name, do you recognise it? Or here's a face, do you recognise it? Okay, so that's a bit about the background of the study itself. On to some thoughts. Firstly, internal validity. So, how convinced are we about things like control over variables and stuff like that? Well, it was a lab environment, standardised procedure. Participants went through a series of tasks in the same order. Obviously the pictures were different depending on their own yearbook and the people they went to school with, but the procedure, the setup was all the same, and carefully controlled in terms of the environment, the timings. Bahrick and colleagues had already run pilot studies to kind of work out where issues were and how long to give participants, how to word questions, things like that. So I'm fairly convinced about that. I think that's a good point. However, they were trying to study duration of LTM. How do we know that these participants didn't, for example, even if they graduated 10 years ago, maybe they were looking at their yearbook at the weekend before the study? If that's the case, is it really 10 years that their LTM has held this information for? Probably not, yeah? But one thing that I think gets missed from the textbooks, if you are aware of this study already, is Bahrick et al. Did actually ask people about things like this. They asked them at the end, probably to avoid demand characteristics, but they asked them at the end to indicate, how close were they to each of the people that they've seen the photos and names for, and how often they look at their yearbook, and how recently they've looked at their yearbook and things like this. And they took that information and they incorporated it into their data analysis. So they kind of, increased or decreased overall scores based on their findings from that those questions. So it allows us to be much more confident of the internal validity, and indeed, therefore, more confident about, is it actually duration of LTM that we have studied. Overall then, I'm going to give Bahrick et al. A 7 out of 10 for internal validity. On to external validity, so that's things like temporal validity, ecological validity, and population validity. It was a natural long-term memory task. Remembering people that you went to school with, involving your yearbook, that's a fairly everyday, or at least natural thing to be doing in comparison to a lot of the other research that we have looked at in terms of memory. So that's a good thing. The task has mundane realism. Does the study have ecological validity though? Well, possibly a little bit because it was a natural task, but it's still an artificial setting, and whether or not the kind of tasks that participants had to do in that lab controlled setting, with kind of fixed questions and scripts and all of that, whether that really translates into real life is still up for debate, but I think it is better than a lot of the other studies, as I said, that you look at for memory. Okay, in terms of population validity, they were Americans, they were college graduates. So is that a criticism? Possibly, but ask yourself, is it likely that non-Americans are going to have significantly different long-term memories? Possibly not. They weren't all just current students, they were a variety of ages and they went to a variety of schools, so it's probably not as much of an issue as, again, other studies that just use a group of current students. 1970s, does it lack temporal validity? Well, again, ask yourself, is it likely that our long-term memories have massively changed over the last few decades in terms of the way they work? Probably not. But it isn't just people from the 1970s either, is it? Because of the sample, because of the nature of what they were looking at, they've included people that were brought up in, people that grew up in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s because of what they were looking at. So again, it's probably not as much of an issue as we see in other studies. And so overall, I'm giving Bahrick et al. A 7 out of 10. Okay, ethics. I think this is a fairly good one for ethics. So clear instructions, no deception needed in this study. Participation was paid or rewarded, so they kind of started by looking for volunteers, looking for kind of people that were at the university, on campus, current students, current staff, kind of friends of friends, that sort of thing. But they ran out, so they went through kind of other organisations to find people and ended up offering money for people to participate as well. Now, is that good? Is it bad? It's not a massive issue, but it does put a little bit of pressure on people to kind of see it through, and possibly they'd have not felt like they could exercise some of their rights, possibly. I don't think it's a massive issue, but it's something to bear in mind. Possibly not so much of an issue because there is no harm done in this study. It's not particularly distressing. They're unlikely to feel kind of embarrassment or anything like that. So even if they were kind of rewarded with course credit or paid, it probably isn't as much of an issue from an ethical point of view as in other studies. We're not aware of any confidentiality or privacy issues. There's no names published, anything like that. And so overall, it's pretty good from an ethical point of view. I'm going to give him 9 out of 10. Okay, applications. It's good obviously from an understanding LTM point of view, but did we really need to run experimental studies to find out that long-term memory is actually quite long-lasting? Possibly not. What I do think is interesting though is this difference that I talked about between recognition and free recall. And I think there are some nice applications here for students and teachers, particularly understanding that, when you're learning, when you're revising, testing yourself by recognizing information, so by just looking at your notes or reading the revision guide or the textbook or whatever it might be, is not a good way of testing what you actually know. Yeah, tested Testing in free recall conditions, a bit like in an exam where there's just the question, you have to recall it without really much of a cue, that is likely to be poorer than testing through recognition. So what we take from this is when you're learning, when you're revising, when you're practicing, you need to be trying to do free recall. That is a much better test of whether you actually understand and remember something. So I think that's good from an application point of view. Also, because it has external validity, it arguably is more useful than a pure kind of artificial study. So there's a few good points there, but in terms of actually understanding, the duration of long-term memory, which was kind of the point of the study, it's not the most convincing thing in the world, but I'm going to give it, and maybe it's a little harsh, but I'm going to give it 6 out of 10 for applications. Exam value. Well, it's not a key study, but that's not the end of the world, because it is still useful for questions involving LTM. You might be asked about the nature of LTM. You might be asked about research into LTM. You might be specifically asked about duration or research into duration. And this is obviously a really good study for picking up the marks in those kind of questions. It is probably the one that your examiners will be looking for since it's in the textbooks. It is helpful for understanding, I think, kind of issues around control of variables. We talked about the issue of did they look at their yearbook, and while you're not going to be specifically asked about that, I think, as I said, understanding kind of in a practical sense how researchers have tried to get around these issues of control is quite useful for that. So not perfect, but overall I think it's a 5 out of 10 from me for exam value. The final verdict. The scores I've given sum to 34, and therefore the mean. My score for the Bahrick et al. Study, 6.8. Bahrick, you're an absolute legend in psychology. Thanks, lad. There you go. That brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much if you stuck with me, and I hope that you found those thoughts useful. Do get involved in the comments and everything else there if you're up for it. Thank you so much, guys. I'll see you again soon in another video. Bish bash bosh.